Once upon a time, some rabbis, a tree, God, and an oven walk into a bar. Or something like that. I can't remember exactly. I told that story last time. You can click on the link in the description or up here to hear that one. But long story short, a bunch of rabbis argue about an oven. Everyone agrees except for one guy, Eliezer. Miracles keep happening to prove Eliezer right. Eventually, God himself announces that Eliezer is right, and the rest of the rabbis tell God to go get stuffed. The story I'm going to tell now is about what happens afterwards. So, having finally ruled against Eliezer and officially overcome God, the rabbis got a little bit excited and took things a little bit too far. Since the debate was about the ritual purity of an oven, they collected that everything that Eliezer had ever declared to be ritually pure, and then burned them in a fire. Bit much. And then it gets worse. Led by Rabban Gamliel, the leader of the Sanhedrin, the leader of the rabbis, they then decided to ostracize Eliezer. They cast him out. Now, Eliezer had a cherished and subsequently legendary disciple, Rabbi Akiva, and Akiva volunteered to take the news to him. He feared that if someone else were to go and ended up showing Eliezer disrespect, then the entire world would be destroyed. More on that later. So, Akiva wrapped himself up in mourner's black, and he sat at 4 cubits distance from his teacher. You can't get any closer to someone who's been ostracized. And when he spoke, he put it very gently. He used euphemism. He said, "Your colleagues, sir, are distancing themselves from you, rather than vice versa. It is reported that, on that day, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives, 1/3 of its wheat, and 1/3 of its barley was destroyed. Everywhere that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze, burned." So it's probably a good thing that Akiva was the one to deliver the message, don't you think? So Rabban Gamliel, the leader of the rabbis who had excommunicated Eliezer, was traveling on a boat at the time. A great wave rose up and threatened to drown him. "It must be because of Rabbi Eliezer," he said, "because God punishes those who mistreat others." He got to his feet and declared that he did not do it for his own benefit, nor for the benefit of his house. Rather, he did it for the unity of the nation, quote, "so that disputes will not proliferate in Israel." In response, the sea calmed its raging. Now, it turns out that Imma Shalom, the wife of the ostracized Rabbi Eliezer, was also the sister of this Rabban Gamliel, who had ostracized him. From that day forth, she would not let her husband lower his head to the ground in prayer. Because, you see, after the set prayers you have to do every morning and afternoon, it had become customary at that time to have a moment of personal appeal to God, a time to speak freely to the Almighty, one-on-one, and make known your hopes and grievances. And during that part of the prayer, you would prostrate yourself. Imma Shalom feared that, were her husband to bemoan his fate at that moment of intimate connection to the Almighty, the Lord would heed his cries, and therefore punish her brother. And so, every morning and every afternoon, she would hover around him as he prayed, and as soon as he finished the obligatory prayers and was about to prostrate himself, she would swoop in and stop him. One hesitates to think how he reacted to that, but it's not stated in the text. Don't know how mad he got. At any rate, on one fateful day, she missed her cue. One report has it that she simply got the date wrong. Another says that a beggar came to the door, and so she went out to give him bread. In either case, for that one moment, she left Eliezer unsupervised. And that was all it took. When she returned, she saw that he had lowered his head to the ground in prayer. She said to him, "Get up. You've already killed my brother." At that moment, the sound of a shofar emerged from the house of Rabban Gamliel to announce that the leader of the rabbis had died. Rabbi Eliezer asked his wife, "How did you know that your brother would die?" And she said to him, "This is the tradition that I received from the house of the father of my father. All the gates of heaven are apt to be locked, except for the gates of prayer for victims of verbal mistreatment." And that's the end of the story of the oven of Akhnai. So, we went from a debate about the ritual purity of an oven to walking trees and rivers going backwards, to the divine intervention of a heavenly voice, and then a full-scale rabbinic rebellion against the authority of God Almighty. And all of that leads up and boils down to this. The moral of the story is that God takes the grievances of the verbally abused more seriously than anything else. If there's an actual point to the story, that's it. Because it's not just the final word. It's the reason the story was brought up in the first place. So, a quick word of explanation. The story of the oven of Akhnai comes from a Jewish text called the Talmud. And the Talmud works by taking a segment of the first official, at least written down legal code, the Mishnah, and then discussing it at length, the Gemara. So in this case, the legal code, the fragment, the segment that they were studying, was concerned with commercial exploitation. Okay? So let's say I know something is really only worth $50, but I sell it to you for $100. Even if you buy it willingly, I'm exploiting you. So even if I'm not technically stealing or technically cheating, and even if I'm not coercing you, it's still wrong. Okay? That's what the Mishnah says. But then it extends the point further. It says that money doesn't even need to exchange hands for there to be exploitation. So the example it gives is this. If I were to ask you, "Hey, how much are you selling this for?" When I know for sure that I have no intention of buying it, then the Mishnah says I'm exploiting you, even if I don't rob a cent from you. Why? Because I'm doing something that's not going to benefit me or anyone else at all, right? But it might hurt you when you get disappointed that you inevitably fail to make a sale. But then the legal code keeps going. It lists 2 other ways to wrong someone by speech alone. And these have absolutely nothing to do with material gain or loss. It says that if someone genuinely repents of their past misdeeds, then it's wrong to bring those actions up. And if someone has converted to Judaism, it's wrong to bring up what their ancestors did, even if what they did went against Jewish law. And that's what the Gemara takes up for discussion. That's what the debate is about in the Talmud, right? The rabbinic sages who composed it, they inquire about the logic here. They seem to be asking, why is harmful speech so serious that the legal code would go from a discussion of business ethics and end up talking about being rude to criminals and converts? And so they discuss that for pages and pages and pages, right? The Gemara, the text, the Talmud declares that causing someone to be publicly humiliated is worse than adultery. Because, it reasons, the punishment for adultery is getting strangled to death. But that's it. After that, you're off the hook. However, if you publicly shame someone, even if that someone has committed adultery, you forfeit any share you might have in the world to come. So you pay for that one forever. Therefore, it's worse to publicly humiliate someone than to commit adultery. It also declares that it's better to be burned alive than to publicly humiliate someone. Now, there's a very funny story behind that, which I'll post down in the comments below. And only after all that, pages and pages of back and forth discussion, interpretation, this, that, only after all that does someone go, and I quote, "On the topic of verbal mistreatment, there's this funny story about an oven." And that's how we get the story of the oven of Akhnai. Now that we're talking about verbal abuse, let's dethrone God. So that's the background to the story, right? And what it shows is that the reason it was brought up in the first place was to make a point about how big a deal it is to hurt people's feelings. All right. That's enough context. So what are we to make of this? Here we have this totally wild, extremely profound, game-changing narrative about the foundations of ethics and the nature of divine authority. And apparently, it was all a setup just to say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but if I say mean words, God will personally fucking kill me. So the story seems to remove God from the position of ultimate moral authority. It seems, at first, to spell the death of God. But no sooner does it do that than it immediately brings him back. More powerful, interventionist, and daddy's gonna judge you than ever. Why? And where does that leave us? Are we in charge here or not? Has God receded into the background? Has he left us to figure things out for ourselves? Or is he only pretending to? Is he being a helicopter parent, hovering just out of sight, ready to swoop down and reassert his authority the moment we get something wrong? So what's going on here? What does this all mean? What are we supposed to take away from this? This is what I'll say about it for now, at least. I think that if you want to make some sense of it, the story does have an overarching consistency, despite the apparent contradictions in God's status. And that's because, ultimately, or at least for now, I don't think the story is really about God. So, it's obviously not about the right way to build ovens. And it's also not about whether trees can walk and whether walls have legal degrees. But it's also not about some of the bigger philosophical questions it brings up along the way. So whether there exists a cosmic justice system which will punish wrongdoing in the end, whether there is an objective fact of the matter about what's wrong and right and who decides that, even whether God exists, all of that is secondary. What I think the story is actually about is responsibility. It asks, who is responsible? And the answer is, we are. In my case, me, and in your case, you. In the first half, it asks, who is responsible for making a decision before we act? And the answer is, we are. And in the second half, it asks, who is responsible for that action after it's done? And the answer is, we are. It's the same answer, but to different questions. And that's why God takes a back seat in the first part and jumps right back into the front seat in the second. It's because he's not actually the central theme. The axle of this wheel is responsibility, and God sort of spins around it. So, if you invoke God in order to get out of the difficulties of thinking for yourself, then God's gone, and he'll go gladly. That's the first part of the story. But then the danger switches from complacency to arrogance. At that point, you might think, okay, because I'm the one who decides what to do, then whatever I decided is necessarily right. And so the story switches tack. You're not going to be able to worm out of your responsibility that way either, right? You have to be brave in taking charge, but humble in the imperfection of your decisions. And I think whether we get punished for it or not isn't really so much the issue here, right? The unavoidable punishment for slander is being a slanderer, and the punishment for cruelty is being cruel, and the rest is ultimately out of our hands, and thus, I think, not our primary concern. Because here's the bottom line. You have to make the best decision you can. But having made the best decision you could does not guarantee that you will be able to sleep at night or die with a clear conscience. For better or for worse, that's the way things really are. You have complete freedom to choose what you do and why you do it before you do it. And you have no freedom whatsoever to change what you've done afterwards, or any real certainty that you got it right. You have to act on incomplete information without some omniscient Jiminy Cricket to whisper the answers in your ear. And if there are any negative side effects or things don't go the way you wanted, well, you can't just throw your hands up and say we live in a moral vacuum, so no foul. The moral vacuum didn't make the decision for you. The moral vacuum didn't say the words that hurt that person. You did. So if we're being honest, that's the situation we're in. And that's what we're faced with in this life. And that's the picture which this story presents, fantastical though it might be. And I think it does that pretty effectively. And so, that's, I think, the reason behind the apparent paradox in the portrayal of God. It's because he's really not that important here, right? The constant fact of our moral responsibility makes the world, or in this case, God, look different in different situations. Our cosmology is relative. Our accountability is, on this account, absolute. So, on the one hand, I think this is just good theology. Whenever you try to say one thing about God, the dickhead flips on you and shows you his rear end. So any story about God should be, by rights, contradictory and paradoxical. God is just the kind of cat that makes Schrodinger's look unambiguous. I also think it speaks wonderfully to the modern condition, right? Somewhere, as we always are, in between antiquity and the future, right? Rationally, there's a lot of stuff which humanity used to take seriously that doesn't quite make sense to us anymore. But the moment we try to throw it out, we realize we just can't get rid of it entirely. There's something there that's important, we quite can't grasp what it is. And so, by and large, we're sort of forced to hold it lightly and live with the paradox. It has that basic structure of its bullshit butt that we all seem to land in one way or another. But also relegating God to this position of a side character who comes in or out of the story depending on whether or not he serves the interests of the plot, that is, our ethical commitments, is just about as Jewish as it gets. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas talks about loving the Torah more than God. In other words, it's the idea that the details of Jewish law, the inquiry into right conduct, is more important than our relationship to the perfect and transcendent being, which makes it pretty important. Now, of course, Judaism can be very spiritual too. It has its mysticism, its Kabbalah, which is totally focused on the nature of God and the higher realities and whatnot. But I think it's fair to say that the mainstream of Judaism is adequately represented in this Talmudic tradition and this story. At the end of the day, it's all about investing the most mundane decisions of daily life with deeper meaning. It's all about how you tie your shoelaces and how you treat your neighbor. And God either fits into that or he gets out of the way. So there we go. That's the oven of Akhnai. God is definitely dead, or at least retired, so you're the boss now. Congratulations. But be careful, because heavy lies the crown.